Howdy, my name is Iggy, and I have the only solo indie game dev channel on YouTube that's under active surveillance by the FBI. This is the second devlog for my game, Romance on the Red Planet, an anti-colonial swashbuckler RPG set on Mars in the 1930s. It's been so long since my last update that I might as well be starting this series over. There's a lot of reasons for my long absence, including a year-long digression for a failed attempt to make a totally dynamic clone of the Ass Creed Origins climbing system, and my arrest in a SWAT raid on my home and my subsequent legal battle and imprisonment. You're probably new here, and if you're not, it's been so long since we last talked that you might as well be. So let me reintroduce the project. This is an action RPG inspired by Fallout, Mount and Blade, and Daggerfall, with a unique combat system focusing on directional melee fighting. I've been busy over the past, 3 years, and the game has come a long way. I've been polishing basically all aspects of the game, but what I really want to show you is all the totally new dynamic procedural systems I've been building. Before we get started, if you think this game looks cool, please try it out. There's a link in the description of this video to join my Discord where you can download the latest public build of the game and play it for yourself. One of the reasons I haven't been working on devlogs these past few years is that I've been going to an indie game dev conference down in Raleigh, North Carolina called Oak City Games. I don't have any footage from these trips, so you're just gonna have to take my word for it. It was amazing seeing my game in the hands of players, and the experience really transformed this project for the better. As much as I've valued and continue to value the feedback you people who live in my computer keep giving me, there's nothing quite like sitting down with a stranger and watching them experience your game in real time. But out of all the feedback I've received, something one lady said really stuck with me. She said, "It's good, but it lacks specificity." That kind of took me out at the knees if I'm being honest with you. To me, Romance on the Red Planet is incredibly specific, and its vision of Mars is deep and unique. There's over 200 years of alternate history, there's religious conflict driven by people trying to adapt to the realities of colonial domination, and even agricultural techniques adapted to a planet on life support. But if you're playing my game or watching these videos, you'd have no idea. This whole time, I thought keeping the visuals bare bones and the narrative non-existent while I worked on mechanics was an act of discipline. But this only makes sense to me, because I've got what this game is supposed to look like locked up in my head. For the player, I don't have anything to pull you into this world or make you care about what you're seeing. Maybe at one point this discipline was good for the project, but I probably passed that point years ago. I need to give you a reason to give a shit, so now I'm going to try to do that. Let's get specific. And let's start with you. You won't be playing a total blank slate. No matter who you decide to become over the course of this game's story, you'll begin your journey as an icon, or a native Martian orphan raised from infancy by wizards to serve a specific heroic purpose. The wisdom of the sorcerers who raised you tells them that you must become the greatest sword fighter who's ever lived. But I've been hard at work on the things you do get to define about your character. Stuff like your stats and traits, and also what you look like. But it turns out that second part is really fucking hard to do. Luckily, my time spent focusing on mechanics has allowed me to really step back and see what I value in game art, and what I'm really going for with the low poly aesthetic. Back when I tried this the first time in 2016, I thought I was really clever for doing low poly art, like no one else was doing that at the time. Things are obviously different now, but I still think a coherent vision and philosophy can set my low poly style apart from the oversaturation of Cinti asset pack based games out there. I knew I wanted every single character in the game to use a single set of meshes and a single skeleton, which meant I knew the revamped character model had to be both robust and flexible. What I needed to figure out was what set of values I wanted to apply to my work, like what constraints make sense for what this project is becoming while prompting art which is coherent and interesting. I experimented with a focus on keeping poly counts low and representing details with textures, so that way I could differentiate, for instance, lamellar and cloth armor using the same armor mesh. But this didn't feel right to me, and producing bespoke textures at scale canceled out a lot of the productivity gains core to my low poly workflow. So rather than sticking to a focus on keeping poly counts low, I instead embraced a value I'm realizing has become important to me in aesthetics generally, and that's honesty in materials. These are meshes made of triangles, and for me, low poly art is about rejecting the impulse to try to conceal the reality that the thing is made of triangles. This is an impulse I think is driven by a norm of chasing photorealism. So I want to foreground the triangles. I want to try and highlight the edges and the planes between them, so my art won't avoid detail where I think it's necessary, but that detail will be made of triangles. I don't think I invented this approach to low poly art or anything, but I think having a coherent set of values will be essential to keeping things cohesive and grounded in a project this large. And a lot of times this is going to mean abandoning quote-unquote good topology, because this topology is valued for its ability to animate without breaking that illusion that the thing's not made of edges and polygons. I actually think the artifacts caused by quote-unquote bad topology add interest to the thing, and just go further to highlight its edges as the thing moves and changes shape. Now that I had worked out a vision for my art, and I put that vision into practice with the new base mesh and the new apparel, I had to figure out how to achieve that goal of robust customization. The way this is often done is with what are called blend shapes, which let you smoothly blend between two versions of the same mesh, but this would mean copying each blend for each piece of clothing and armor in the game. And I'm making an RPG here, and if you can't play dress up with your little guy, what's the point? So I looked at an alternative, adjustment bones. It's actually way simpler than I thought, and probably something you could do pretty easily in your own projects if you wanted. You literally just make a copy of each bone you want to adjust, and then make that copy a child of the bone that's going to be animated. That's it. So now I've got a base character with hundreds of apparel and hair meshes that can all be customized at runtime. I'm all set, right? Of course not. That's the kind of hubris which gets viciously punished in game dev. The next step is actually implementing all this in-engine. I need to tell Unity how to move and scale these adjustment bones and which meshes to apply at runtime. All that information needs to be stored in a system of data objects which can be saved and loaded. The more I thought about this, the more I realized it would take years of hard work to get something like this workable in-game. And I'm sure it did take years of hard work for the lovely people who maintain the UMA framework. Luckily, those lovely people have made that work freely available for any of us to use. The UMA toolset is incredible to use, and its system of slots, recipes, and DNA can already do everything I need to get the character customization and apparel system up and running. It's easy to define DNA too. Too easy. My character avatar has over 200 DNA sliders to customize its appearance. I cannot stress this enough, dear viewer. Do not do this. It is not worth it. This took me months of tedious work to fully hook up and tweak. Viewer, you've only got this one life to live. You don't know how many days you have left. When I was in jail, I fully realized for the first time just how much touching a loved one's face or feeling the soil beneath your feet or the sun on your skin is really worth. Viewer, I am begging you to learn from my bad example. Do not spend your time on this green earth hunched over a keyboard fucking around with 200 sliders. Nothing to be gained by these means is worth what it will take from you. You gotta be satisfied with like 50 to 60 sliders. That being said, these look sick as hell, right? Look at these little guys. I can set up these randomizers, which come out of the box with the UMA framework, by the way, to show how varied these characters can look. And because they all share the same underlying geometry, aesthetic consistency is just not a problem. The enemy NPCs you can fight in the current build actually already use two different randomizers, one which makes Anglo-Martian militiamen and the other which makes vampiric world eater cultists. Just with these two enemy types, we've already got theoretically infinite characters generated at runtime. That's kind of incredible all on its own. If you look at these guys, I feel like you can finally get an idea of what this game is actually going to be like. Because I put in that unreasonable and inadvisable level of work up front, you can now stab an infinite number of bad guys, and each of those bad guys is going to be specific to Romance on the Red Planet. So this infinite variation of body shape and facial features gives the world texture and depth, and some of those bodies having green skin and pointy ears lets you know that the world is somewhere other than Earth. But when we start to put clothes on those bodies, we run into some thorny philosophical and technical issues. Let's start with the technical stuff. Something I've been planning to implement from the start is a very simplified layered armored system, like what they've got in Fallout 4 and the Kingdom Come games. Originally, I had planned to split all clothing into sleeves and torso meshes, and to hide each part when the corresponding armor piece is put on, but actually using blend shapes here to collapse all the vertices is much easier, and sidesteps a lot of the problems I was having with making all the seams line up. Now you can wear armor over any shirt in the game and it just works. I have the straps and belts included in the gear items adjust to fit over armor the same way, though some clipping is unfortunately inevitable here. Taking this concept a little further, embracing higher poly counts and the ability to adjust apparel meshes at runtime also opened up another avenue for player expression and world building by splitting footwear and pants into separate items. To make sure any kind of footwear will work with every single pair of pants or set of leg armor in the game, I added a new adjustment bone for the hem of your pants, and the position and scale of the hem is controlled by the footwear UMA recipe. This adds another lever I can pull for storytelling through apparel, which is something I'm finding myself thinking about more and more. To an extent, tropes and familiarity are bound up in the basic premise of this game. I'm making a game about knights and cowboys fighting Nazis on Mars, and I've been aiming at the unique vibe which arises out of the sharp contrast coming out of those anachronisms. So if the knights are not recognizable as knights and the cowboys are not recognizable as cowboys, that's going to blur the contrast and, at least I think, make the final product less fun and interesting. Additionally, I want to use familiar European medieval fantasy tropes to make the player immediately comfortable and able to locate themselves within the material culture of the native Martians, so the contrast with the anachronistic elements brought in by colonialism becomes thematic as well as aesthetic. But this brings us back to the problem we've been talking about this whole video: specificity. Here, my new approach to the art and the capabilities enabled by my toolset have given me a solid base to work from. So often in fantasy or historical art, we reproduce the gestalt impression of what people wore without understanding the individual items which come together to create that impression, or why those individual items were worn in the first place. Once you have an eye for this sort of thing, it becomes impossible to watch almost any show or movie that has actors wearing armor. It's always just a leather jacket with random shit bolted onto it. When we discard the crutch afforded by the lower level of detail, most of my old character art was like this. Step 1 was sidestepping this kind of vague, ungrounded art. After a lot of research, I'm able to leverage the increased detail in this art direction and the layering of gear, armor, footwear, and clothing to create familiar impressions while remaining concrete and believable. And once we have a believable base in the familiar, we can branch out and get a little weird with specific items, and dive into the places where I've gone beyond the tropes of genre fiction a little. Let's use those World Eater cultists I talked about earlier as an example. They're considered alien even within the cultures indigenous to Mars, and representing them with the red and black armor like I did in older builds just isn't going to cut it. See, while mainstream native Martian society values self-sacrifice and shared struggle, collectively maintaining the fragile balance with the decaying biosphere of Mars, the cultists worship greed and divine destruction associated with the long-dead dragons of Mars. They know they live on a dying world, and they want to eat it while it's still alive. They use the same sacred libations of the mutagenic dragon blood oil that gave you your enhanced abilities as an icon, except while you underwent that dangerous ceremony only once as a child, the vampiric cultists do it every chance they get. This leads to acute dragon oil poisoning, causing their metabolisms to increase dramatically, their bodies to warp and grow painfully deformed, and their skin to become so sensitive to light that it'll burn in the sun. That's why they cover themselves in bandages like mummies. But seeing as they're all insane cannibals, their armor can get a little crazy without breaking the grounded vibe I'm going for. Why not have their gear include a severed head on a spike along with their bags? Why not make their backpacks cauldrons to cook you up in after they kill you? Or maybe before. My favorite little touch is their maw helmet, which is designed to mimic their dragon god's gaping mouth that will, they believe, one day swallow Mars whole. And here's where the pipeline I've worked out combining my item data objects and the UMA framework really comes in handy. I thought in addition to all that weird, gross stuff that vampires have, wouldn't it be cool for them to have lamellar armor made out of bone? Possibly human bone. With the system I set up, this literally took less than a minute to make. In the item data, I define a list of armor and clothing parts that are all kit bashed together at runtime. And of more interest to us here is that all those parts are assigned a single color scheme, which is also defined here in the item data. All I had to do was make a copy of the regular lamellar armor and turn down the metalness in the armor chest secondary color and set the albedo to a beige bone color. And bam, we're done. It's only slightly more involved to make a totally unique apparel item using this system, and I'm hoping over time this saves me enough pain and dev time that it makes up for all the time I spent fiddling with those sliders. This is the part I really wish that lady in Raleigh could see, because the thing that got her started on her specificity criticism was seeing a lion roaming the canyon biome. She said, "That doesn't make me feel like I'm on Mars." Ironically, the inclusion of the lion is supposed to be odd and incongruous with the alien biosphere, but since I made the really inspired decision to include the lion as the only creature in that build, it kind of makes sense why it didn't have the desired effect. While I wanted the material culture of the native Martians to be immediately recognizable to the player as European or Orientalist fantasy art, I decided I'd let myself go buck wild with the creature designs. One of my favorite gags in fiction is when someone comes up with an absolutely ridiculous premise and takes it 100% serious in the most stone-faced, meticulous way. You might be able to tell that this whole project is sort of an exercise in this. But with the creatures, I didn't want to just copy what Edgar Rice Burroughs put on his Barsoom, or tried to include generic alien-looking monsters. So I decided, what if the animals on Mars were mythical creatures on Earth? That would fit with the fantasy vibe for the native Martians, and it's sort of believable that the rifts in space-time that allowed the French colonists onto Mars 120 years ago could also let some Martian critters go the other way onto Europe or Asia and get recorded in Earthling legends. This isn't a final list at all, but this is what I've got so far. First, we have the Minotaur. I figured a creature that has a human body is going to be a hard sell as a naturally occurring animal, but maybe another great ape like a gorilla could work. I liked the idea of it walking on its knuckles, but but I took it a little farther and figured, what if they're like giant ground sloths? So they've got these big long claws for stripping branches off of trees and walk on their knuckles to protect them. So hopefully you look at this thing and say, yeah, that's a minotaur, but when you see it in the environment, it's clear it has an ecological niche. Next, let's look at the cockatrice, which you can probably tell was based on a velociraptor. This one is pretty self-explanatory. It's literally just a raptor with a rooster head, though I had a lot of fun making the feathers on this one, and really came to respect the beauty and ferocity of the humble rooster through my research. We don't really think about how beautiful and strange these birds are just because they're so common as livestock. I'll check back in a later video to tell you whether or not I got a pet rooster, but we should move on. To fill out the colder biomes, I made a bipedal mountain goat based on a Pachycephalosaurus. I thought this was a crazy unique idea that hadn't been done before, but after finishing it, I realized that I had recreated a tauntaun from first principles. On this one, you can see how I'm doing low poly fur in my game. I knew I wanted to try shell texturing for fur, like how they did the pinatas in Viva Pinata, or the fur on Seif in Dark Souls 1, but I couldn't get a shell texturing shader to work in the Unity HD render pipeline. That was until I saw how some of Protofractor's creatures were fuzzy even when you looked at them inside of Sketchfab. I downloaded the creatures to see how they did it, and it blew my mind how simple their solution was. They just manually create the shells and then put a transparent fur texture on them. I tried this with what I'm calling the satyr and also the lions, and I think it looks pretty good. This one is a drake. I think every fantasy story needs a big lizard, so this is a big lizard. Here we have probably my favorite creature design I've ever done, my take on a manticore. I knew I wanted to highlight the creature's eyes and its agility and hunger before I even got started in Blender. I used to sketch these guys while I was sitting at my desk back when I worked security back in the day. The face is based on that monkey who took a selfie, and the body is based on that freaky hairless baboon in the second Gladiator movie. Also, did you know that the OG medieval bestiaries described the manticore as being blue, but when most of those bestiaries were illustrated, the creature was usually colored red, so I gave it a blue-black coloration and a red mane to split the difference. I think I might have fucked up the values in the AI behaviors for strafing, because when it enters combat, sometimes it'll do this little wiggle back and forth, but it's so off-putting when combined with those crazy eyes that I think I'm gonna leave it like that. Okay, so this one is maybe too specific. My partner saw me make this, and she says she's not playing where she can run into this thing, and I do admit that inflicting this on the player is a pretty fucked up thing to do. See, when I approached the idea of doing a harpy creature, I decided that for some of these things, I actually wanted to embrace having human-like features, and maybe hint at some esoteric lore reasons why this might be the case. The female harpy resembles the monster you're used to, and it uses its power of flight to hunt for food while the male defends the nest. So I thought, what if this drives harpies to have extreme sexual dimorphism? And while the females are based on birds, the males are based on their larger extinct cousins in the theropod family like T-Rex. So we have a theropod with a human head. I'm sorry. By the way, this guy's using animations from user Seth U. Tyrannus' Tyranno model in Sketchfab, which they kindly released under the Creative Commons Attribution license. If you look back at the first two videos on this channel, and please don't, they're not very good, you can see that the ghoul was literally the first enemy character I ever made for a video game. They were sort of inspired by the white apes from Princess of Mars, but also, and you might be able to tell this, they were inspired by the Wendigo character Mike Mignola designed for either Hellboy or BPRD, I'm not sure which. In earlier builds, these things were called Wendigos, but given that this game is about colonial violence, I wanted to be more thoughtful about which cultural references I'm borrowing from and how. I think ghoul fits better anyhow. These guys are great apes adapted for hunting humans, and they'll drag you back to their layers of rotting flesh to feed on you at their leisure. Ghouls are so central to the nightmares of the inhabitants of Mars that the Earthling colonists have established an entire guild/secret society of monster hunters called Ghoul Finders specifically to deal with them. I like ending things on the revamp of the creature I made 10 years ago. It feels like it takes us full circle. Looking at that old design and the old combat and really everything in my original attempt at game design, you can see how much I've learned about the craft by tinkering in the gaps that God gives me between ordeals. The most difficult part for me is recognizing that, just like 3D modeling, systems design, and programming, talking about my game with strangers and showcasing it with any kind of appeal is also a skill I need to get better at over time. Well, there's nothing to it but to do it. I hope this video was enjoyable to watch, and I hope you learned something interesting about my project. Thanks for watching until the end. Honestly, if you made it this far, you should subscribe so you can see part 2 and part 3 of this update, where I talk about combat systems, stats, dialogue, and procedural level generation. Remember that you can download the current public build from the New Builds Drop Here channel on my Discord. If you want to try it out, please let me know what you think. And if you've got the time and inclination, recorded footage of your experience with the game is extremely useful. Until next time, stay dangerous.